Just a day after his unprecedented visit to Kyiv, U.S. President Joe Biden is in neighboring Poland.
President Putin is confronted with something today that he didn't think was possible a year ago. The democracies of the world have grown stronger, not weaker. But the autocrats of the world have grown weaker, not stronger.
Poland is a key player in helping shape the outcome of the war in Ukraine. Biden used his speech in Warsaw to praise NATO's unity over the past year, but also warned of hard and bitter days ahead. This as Russia and Ukraine each are preparing spring offensives. Alexandra Chyczij is the national president of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress and vice president of the Ukrainian World Congress. Ihor Michalchyshyn is the CEO and executive director of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. Thank you both so much for coming in.
Thank you.
Alexandra, I'd like to start with you. President Biden, he's in Poland today, but yesterday we saw that striking image of him in Kyiv. Does that give you reassurance that the West and the U.S. especially are in this for the long term?
Absolutely. I mean, the leadership of the Americans, and in particular President Biden, has been crucial to keeping the unity of the allies behind the fight in Ukraine, and that was a highly symbolic and very important gesture that he made at considerable risk to himself.
Ihor, I remember very early after the Russian invasion, the headlines were screaming Kyiv was going to fall in 48 hours. That massive convoy of trucks and tanks and soldiers was just outside the city, and yesterday the President of the United States was there. What was that like for you?
I think it proves that the Ukrainian armed forces and the people of Ukraine have stepped up, obviously using the weapons and that allies have sent, but also their own ingenuity, their own innovations in terms of the drone warfare, the way that they're frankly capturing and repurposing Russian tanks and Russian equipment that's just been abandoned. It speaks to the fact that Ukraine has suffered in the past, and the people aren't willing to abandon it and are there for the long haul, and are, I think, thrilled to have international allies with them at this important time.
Alexander, Ukraine pushed back. It will fall in 48 hours to get to the point where we're a year into this, and it's launched a counteroffensive and retaken a lot of territory. I wonder, though, a lot of that is dependent on Western aid. You look at Russia, the sanctions were meant to choke off the military capacity of that country. Its economy is not shrinking as people expected. It still is able to do this. I mean, are those efforts working as well as you'd hoped?
I think they're having impact, but I don't think we've seen the sanctions from hell that President Biden promised earlier on in this battle. And unfortunately, we have oil and gas revenue coming in from non-allied countries like India and China. The EU have done an incredible job in terms of weaning themselves, but unless there is a worldwide resistance to purchasing Russian fossil fuels, their machine will continue to be.
What would a sanction from hell look like in your view? I know that's Joe Biden's language. That's what he promised. I mean, what would that look like?
I mean, more of the same, a full trade embargo, declaration of Russia as a terrorist state, which would isolate them completely. We, of course, at the Ukrainian Canadian Congress have been pushing for that very declaration because it is incomprehensible to us to have a foreign influence like Russia operating at will in Canada.
So speaking of Russia, Ihor, just this week, Secretary of State Blinken warned that China may be getting ready to help Russia. And we know Beijing's top diplomat is in Moscow today to meet with Sergei Lavrov. I mean, how worried are you that China may step into this, and what would that mean on the battlefield of Ukraine?
Well, as Alexandra was saying, we see that, I mean, Russia has had impact of sanctions. They aren't able to get all the parts they might need, or so they're looking to allies. They've been looking to a number of allies, and China is sort of the most high profile this week. I think it's reassuring that the Americans and the allies of Ukraine are speaking up strongly to sort of deter and warn countries that are taking these kind of potential steps or sort of baby steps towards that kind of loosening of relations with Russia. It's part of the international United Nations, criminal justice into the genocide and war crimes that's happening. I think that's where these countries, South Africa has also had military exercises with the Russians. So I think there has to be a reckoning at the international level about the evidence-based genocide and war crimes that have occurred, and having these countries answer for that in a public forum.
But if there's a country with the industrial and military capacity to have an impact, China getting involved would be problematic.
Incredibly problematic, and I think that's why we're glad to see that there's this proactive, statements, leaking of intelligence, whatever you call it, that there's a active effort underway to dissuade them from this, to show them that they would be well against the international mood and wave of support for Ukraine.
So, Alexandra, as there are warnings of China potentially getting involved in some capacity and warnings to stay away, the requests for fighter jets have gone largely or completely unfulfilled. No one has volunteered to give Ukraine the fighter jets that President Zelensky and others are asking for. Do you think that will happen? Do you think that can happen, or is that just too far for the Allies to go?
No, I think it can. Just as we heard that tanks were off the table, I think we will soon see that fighter jets are a possibility. Some of the G7 and NATO countries have indicated a willingness to supply fighter jets if the Americans go first.
Right. So, Ihor, do you think that will happen? Does it need to come with a guarantee that the jets will not leave Ukrainian airspace? Because the NATO concern is taking steps that trigger a broader war, and planes can go deep into Moscow in a way tanks cannot, right?
I think that, again, we've been seeing that there's also training being offered to some of the Ukrainian armed forces, the Air Force specifically, about the potential machines, the weapons that they'll be using, and both in the tanks and the Air Force. I think the question of sort of political control over the weapons that Ukraine has got has been a big one in this last 8 to 10 months, and Ukraine has shown itself responsible. And I don't think that President Zelensky, and he said this, they have no intention of going in and invading Russia. They're pushing the Russians out. So I think there is evidence that they're responsible and can control and measure their actions to that, pushing the Russians out. Of course, there are things like supply lines. There are things like resupply that are critical to doing that. Again, we believe that the ball has been moving positively towards Ukraine's support on all of these fronts, and with missiles, with fighter jets, with tanks. I think everything is possible, and unfortunately, as Putin sort of continues the war, I think that more steps will be needed.
I wonder, Alexandra, just as a sort of a final topic, Canada's role in this, a year in. Generous in support, limited in what it can offer militarily just because of the situation of our military, but also Canada has become a home to a lot of Ukrainians who have fled the war to come here. What more do you want to see from the country, and how do you think the people who have had to flee their homeland and settle temporarily in Canada are being looked after?
Well, certainly the government of Canada was very generous in offering them the special emergency travel visa to allow Ukrainians to come here in need of refuge. Our community has risen to the call to help our brothers and sisters from Ukraine. It has been a gargantuan effort, and we are truly blessed to have a Ukrainian-Canadian community that has been stepping up to the plate, and of course the generosity of Canadians. My phone did not stop ringing in the first days of the war. Businesses, individuals, all wanting to help, opening their hearts and their homes to Ukrainians.
Ihor, I wonder when this ends, and assuming Ukraine wins, do you think a lot of the people who fled put down new roots and stay where they are, or do they go home? And if there's population loss beyond the casualties of war, what does that mean for Ukraine's future?
Difficult to say. I think it'll depend on how long people are away, how long they've settled here, and what they have to go back to. We've talked about that there are parts of Ukraine that are bombed to smithereens, communities that they may not be able to get back to. So I think it's going to be an individual decision for families weighing their economic options, the best for their children. What I'm hearing, again, there have been people already going back, that Canada, while welcoming on a temporary basis, isn't home, and these people have not left under planned circumstances. And so the pull of Ukraine is strong, and the pull to be with family. On the other hand, we know that people will make their choices based on what's best for their family, and how difficult it would be to then uproot themselves again to go back to a very uncertain situation. I think we're going to see a new model where people are going to be traveling back and forth more often, There will be huge reconstruction, huge opportunities, but also huge psychological barriers and emotional barriers for people to return where they had fled.
Okay. I want to thank you both for coming in at this important time. Alexandra Chyczij and Ihor Michalchyshyn, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.